This is a guy who has come from nothing, burned through it all, and he survived.
This autopsy tells me more about how he lived than how he died.
That switch goes on, and they were Sonny and Cher. As soon as the camera stopped rolling, Sonny went that way, Cher went that way.
News just broke all over the world that this big rapper was dead.
He didn't look like a criminal. He didn't act like a criminal.
Ted Bundy showed the world that evil can also be good looking.
There are things that I've witnessed in this case that you simply would not believe.
So for those of you who might not have been here, I'm Jen Bramley, and I'm the Vice President of Government Public Affairs for Cox Communications. Thank you all for being here. I am very excited to be moderating this very esteemed panel of people. We have Adam Falk, who's the Senior VP of Government Affairs for Charter Communications. We have John Gibbs, who's the Vice President for State Government Affairs for Comcast. Michael Grover, who is my lifeline, that's all you need to know, from Cox Communications, the Vice President and a go-to person, no doubt, for us. And Tim Wilkerson, who is now President of NECTA. Very impressive, Tim, and hosting this 51st conference. So happy to have you guys here today. In case you didn't see this morning, you can text in questions whenever you would like. So you're going to text NECTA to the number 22333. So as we get some questions from you guys, we'll take them in the monitor, and we'll also point out to you a little bit as we go through and see if you have anything to ask. So let's get started. A little bit going on in our industry, I guess. So Adam, why don't we start with you? What do you think is the biggest misconception about our industry? What could we tell better as a story?
I mean, I think we still have sort of that age-old issue of folks still thinking that we're a monopoly. That's been one that's been around for a long time. That I think is still out there. That's part of the story that we need to tell. The other is seeing the cable industry as a technology leader. You know, despite all of the good things that we're doing, all the investment and innovation of our industry, it still always seems like someone wants to talk about some other industry as a leader in the technology space. So I would say those are two of the ones that come to mind.
Great. John, do you agree?
Well, I do agree. I think Adam hit them so spot on. Those would have been my first two, and absolutely the first one. This notion that we don't have competition or that we're a monopolist has befuddled me for decades now, because you're usually having that conversation with somebody who's telling you the story about their daughter who has a dish somewhere, or their son-in-law who's just changed, you know, wireless providers or the like, and then we're having a conversation about our products in those spaces, and so much of what we do is just not even the first in, right. Frankly. But the innovation story, that's the challenge, because we have been an innovator so long that it's not just a new name and new innovation, it's another innovation from Comcast or Charter or Cox and the like, and has just a little bit less punch as a result, I believe, and with some of the policymakers. So I was speaking with a few legislators this midday who said, we had a great Massachusetts conversation this morning, and you know, it just gets down to one thing. You guys are so good, you bring so much, you know, investment, you know, here to New England. You just need to tell that story. Yeah. And thank you, and we will. We appreciate all the help too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Michael, what keeps you up at night? Give us one or two states.
Well, clearly California. Not that Rhode Island doesn't cause some angina.
Thanks.
But clearly, California is probably the most active these days with the privacy work that's going on there. I worry about any state where the politics are controlled by one party, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, because then the arguments are not about a policy necessarily, they're about personalities, and things can get sideways very quickly. I think this coming year, it will be interesting to see, we operate in 2 states, Virginia and Arizona, that have very close Democrat-Republican splits in 1 or 2 of the houses, and to see whether or not we become a political football as one party or the other tries to use an issue, a privacy issue or a rates issue or some sort of issue to try to tip that balance in their legislatures.
Yeah. So you've mentioned privacy a couple of times in California. Let me go back to John for a second. John, CCPA, we're all talking about it, unfortunately. But, you know, a lot of state legislators will ask us when we go into their offices, well, you know, California's already done this. Why don't we just do this in our states too? Is that how it should go?
Well, that might be the answer, because California's already done this. The fact is that all of our companies are national companies in scope, and the privacy questions are universal questions for our business, have no special respect for state lines. And so we will have largely the same policies and practices for all of our customers in America. So for good and for bad, there is a sort of bar that is set by whomever is set. I think that the better answer, though, is it's clearly a federal question. And would we follow California in every federal question or every national policy issue in America? No. And so really, I think, unless someone's going to actually mimic the statute of another state, it's proper, I think, to think about whether it's a federal question or there's some state uniquenesses that suggest special state legislation. I think in the case of privacy with these national systems and networks, it's really not a state-specific question. But let's say we're talking about California. You know, that's a bill that was passed 2 years ago, CCPA, essentially to avoid a rather draconian ballot measure. And so a lot of thoughtful people did their very best in a relatively short period of time, and they enacted the CCPA. And even the proponents, even the chief authors, as they announced that bill, said this is a work in progress. We're going to be back next year. We're going to work to clarify some of this, see if we can make this work. But this is a work in progress. We've got to do something. There won't be a ballot measure. Then the next year they did come back, and they worked hard, and we worked hard. Lots of folks in good spirit worked hard. And there were some clarifications made, indeed. All of the cable companies and ISPs and tech companies have worked hard now to put some practices in place that hopefully will comply with that statute. But they didn't get all the way. And several of the clarifications and fixes that were enacted had a one-year sunset because this stuff is hard. It's hard work. It's complicated. And the impatient in this ecosystem nonetheless said, well, you know, they didn't fix this perfectly. And now we're confronted with yet another ballot measure in California that's seeking to be qualified to be on the November 2020 ballot. So I think the combination of those 3 developments suggests whatever you do, you really don't want to just follow California, because you're following something that's basically a script not yet written.
Right. Michael, did you want to add to that?
When they say, you know, shouldn't we just adopt California's law? The question is which one and in what point in time? I don't think that story is written. I don't think it will be written until 2021 at the earliest, if the ballot measure makes the ballot, and there's a whole new portion of the statute. I think that the AG, the Attorney General, just issued a preliminary regulations on implementing it. I think that there will be potentially some litigation to those rules that could go well into next year. So if I were a legislator in another state, For better or worse, California has set the table, but they keep changing where the silverware is, and I would wait until it was settled before implementing another version of whatever version of the CCPA they want to do, or some other law.
I would
go
just say,
ahead.
I think legislating via ballot measure is a bad idea. I mean, you're talking about a 25 or 30-page statute, I think, that they intend to put on the ballot for the citizens of California to decide. That, to me, is, as a process, is fraught with peril.
They seem to do that a lot.
They do.
In California.
Yeah, no, they do. But I mean, good or bad, the legislative process is there in order to have an opportunity for give and take and to fix things that create unintended consequences. One of the problems with this ballot measure is, that has a provision in it that basically says you can only make the laws basically stricter in interpretation. And we know that when you legislate, there's often need for readjustments to be made, and at least as it's currently crafted, I think it would make that very difficult.
So I think
it does not repeal the law of unintended consequences.
It does not repeal that law. I think what you hear are words out of sort of battle-scarred and battle-weary contestants too. And I would say to the policymakers in the room, it's absolutely appropriate to be asking whether constituents' privacy is protected. And I would never criticize that question and the exploration of this issue as a matter of policy. But I would implore folks to let's go slow, sort of as Grover says, and let's just see if there are real concerns after we run with the current regime for a year or two, based on the California statute.
So hearing that, Adam, what are we doing to protect consumer privacy? I mean, that is a concern of our legislators. They're watching bigger companies like the Facebooks, et cetera. They're worried about elections. What are we doing?
I mean, I think as John said, most of us we understand that there is a positive consumer result from protecting the privacy interests of our customers. And so, whether it be in Washington or whether it be in the States, we're offering real solutions to try to address the issue. And whether that's a matter of transparency in making sure our customers understand how their privacy is protected, making sure that we have appropriate terms and conditions in our service agreements so that customers understand how and in what circumstances their privacy is going to be protected. I mean, those are all parts of the equation, but mostly we're engaging. We're sitting there at the table and we're trying to offer real options and solutions. And our teams, I don't do our stuff on Capitol Hill, but I know that our federal teams are spending a lot of time as well, as John said, trying to find a bipartisan solution, on Capitol Hill to address the issue. So
Great.
There's a lot happening, and we're part of that.
And all of our policy statements can be found on our websites. They're clearly there, front and center for customers and our officials to see. Tim, let me go to you for a second. So I just mentioned Facebook, and I think it's being called now Techlash. But I know here in Rhode Island we have Congressman Cicilline, who's chair of the antitrust subcommittee, and he's calling in the heads of these major social media groups and the Googles of the world. So how does that affect our industry, what's happening with that?
Well, I think it goes back to misunderstanding and how we're misunderstood. I think that I speak to legislators and regulators, and they say, the ecosystem in general is broken. And I said, yes, but you never see our company's names on the front page of any newspaper. You don't see us leading any headlines on television that we've mishandled people's data. And I think there's a reason why. We are fundamentally different than all those other companies at Facebook, et cetera. who unfortunately have mishandled data, who have mistrust, where we have a bargain for exchange. Every single month you pay, and every single month you know exactly what we're doing with your data, which is nothing. I find it very ironic that people think when they go on Google, they go on Facebook, that it's free, and they think it stays that way. There's a reason why these companies are worth billions and billions of dollars, because they are aggregating that data, your personal data, and they're selling it. That's not what these companies do.
Right.
You know, you don't hear about our companies on the front page of these privacy things, and I think one of the reasons for that, and it's a story that doesn't get told, but we have to comply with probably the most restrictive and punitive privacy statute in federal law. It's Section 631 of the Cable Act. And while that law does not apply to our non-cable services, that ethic of protecting consumers' privacy, being sensitive to that, I think is part of the culture of the cable industry and has had a real impact on how we deal with consumer data that we gather through other means than just through video subscriptions. So I think that that's a story that we could tell better, not necessarily wanting 631 to apply to everybody, but it's an important part of how the industry has been cognizant of and very protective of consumer privacy for 35 years, since 1984 when that statute was signed.
Okay. Let's go to another light topic. How about net neutrality, John? Could you give us just, a few-minute overview on what net neutrality is? Because I think it's another area where there's a lot of misperception on how our companies actually relate to that term, what we really believe in, and what it is.
Well, yeah, it's a bumper sticker that's had wide appeal and a good amount of use over the last few years. And most recently, of course, net neutrality became this combination of net neutrality and Title II sort of old-fashioned telephone regulation. And yet the bumper sticker stuck with net neutrality. And so so the net neutrality is basically the no throttling, no blocking, the way we have been conducting ourselves on the internet. And yet the idea of regulating the internet, perhaps with some jurisdictional rationale to get to net neutrality a few years back, that then triggered an order from the FCC that then triggered a repeal of that order, that then triggered litigation, has the whole thing convoluted and complex. So at this point, our company's policies relative to blocking, throttling, and the like, they're published. The FTC has jurisdiction over that. It's another one of these issues. It's essentially federal. There's nothing state unique about the management or governance of the internet. And so to state policymakers, we want to reiterate, we're for net neutrality, and our track record is crystal clear on that. And we're frankly for net neutrality federal legislation. Put an end to the madness, put an end to the ping pong of one FCC or another FCC or the like. But let's not use that really attractive bumper sticker to do things that really have nothing to do with net neutrality, but would march us back to an anti-investment, if you will, regulatory structure. And what came to be known as the net neutrality order really was that. And so that's what a lot of this litigation that you read about and some of this policy contention that you hear about is about. It's not about net neutrality and the no blocking and throttling and the like.
Right. So, Adam, we're seeing a lot of states talk about net neutrality, as John just mentioned. They feel like the federal government wasn't really moving, at least legislatively. I know the FCC has done some actions, but we actually had a former FTC commissioner who came into Connecticut and to Rhode Island. He was under Obama, and he said, this is interstate commerce. This is not something that you should be regulating state by state. It's sort of like regulating airplanes. Are you really going to have different regulations in Rhode Island than you do in Connecticut? And now the airplane's going to do something in the middle. So what does this do by going state by state on so many of these issues?
be a short impact in Rhode Island, right? If you had Wait, this is in place. No, it's not.
You were married here. You're
yes.
connected here.
Yeah, I mean, it creates a mess, really. You know, it's and I think the FCC was right in terms of trying to create blanket preemption, and not because, you know, we're again, as John said, against net neutrality, but it really shouldn't be regulated at the state level. And you know, I think that some of the interpretations of the court decision, the D.C. Circuit decision, are probably beyond really what where I think the court intended for it to go.
Can you explain that a little bit more so that people understand what that was?
Yeah, I mean, the FCC in its order put in place a blanket preemption. The court said that they shouldn't, that the blanket preemption was essentially not appropriate, but that it wasn't reaching a conclusion about conflict preemption, which is sort of looking at a state statute or a state executive order and determining whether that statute or executive order is preempted by a federal law. And so, you know, there's a number of lawsuits that are out there in Vermont and California, in which the question of whether there's conflict preemption between those statutes that were passed and the FCC's decision establishing that net neutrality is a Title I information service. And by the way, the court was very clear about deference and the sort of Chevron administrative deference that needs to be given to the FCC in reaching that conclusion, even though it kind of wiped out this blanket preemption. It opened the door for the courts in the future to consider conflict preemption, looking at the difference between the statute and the FCC's order. So we expect that, you know, that would bear positive fruit in the future. But yeah, as John said, I mean, it's an interstate service. It's kind of difficult to regulate net neutrality and regulate it differently across state lines, and that's one of the reasons why we think that there should be federal legislation, you know, here to address it.
Great. And you mentioned Title I, and you had mentioned Title II. Michael, how about a little education on Title I and Title II? Why is Title II give us nightmares?
Well, I was listening to a podcast where Gigi Sohn, who was in the Wheeler, Wheeler FCC, was being interviewed, and she was talking about how the Wheeler net neutrality order, that how flexible Title II is, which is what governs telecommunication services, you know, plain old telephone service. She said how flexible it was because you can decide not to enforce certain things, even though it's a really big law. You can only enforce certain provisions of it. She neglected to say that the next FCC could change their mind and start doing other things. So it's highly regulatory. It was written in the 1930s. It was updated last, I think, in 1996, the year after I started working in cable. And so it's a law that would not be amenable to the fast-paced change that is technology. Title I, on the other hand, which is how broadband service has been regulated through almost all of its history, except when I first started, remember when we thought it was a cable service and we paid franchise fees on it, and then we had to explain why we weren't paying franchise fees anymore? Anyways, that is much less regulatory and allows us to provide the services and the products that our customers are asking for within certain limited parameters.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, one of the interesting things is it's been, what, a year and a half since a little bit more than a year since the order became effective, and I keep waiting for the great, awful, you know, example of net neutrality violation to come to light. And you know, they're all looking for it. Everybody's out there looking for the horrible example, and not a single one has come up. Everyone talks about the Verizon wireless issue with the wildfires 2 years ago. But I think it's arguable whether that was a net neutrality issue or whether it was a communication issue or the inability to buy the right plan that you needed. So.
Right. Okay. So at this point, I want to go out to the audience. Does anybody in the audience have a question? We haven't gotten any text yet, in case you don't remember the number. Did you text, Eric? Oh, all right.
Test. Oh, look.
This is a test.
There's been a test.
To see how
Rob
big
got
the
called
font
out
shows
that
up.
he's.
It's big enough.
Hopefully it will come up. Anyway, the number for everybody is 22333. So you text NECTA to join the conversation.
So
And,
if you, for a topic that if no one wants to ask, one of the things that we're looking at for 2020 is we're getting more and more into home security and alarms and home automation. That area is a whole area that is ripe for some streamlining, some rationalization of some of the policies. We have one issue where several states require you to read the license number for your alarm license, which makes sense on a brochure or on a television because you put it under there, but for a radio ad, and sometimes we have several of these licenses, you have to read them out loud, or a billboard. And so we are going in, we're taking some baby steps to go in and see if there's a way that we can make it simpler for us as a company that sends folks into people's homes to make these installations, as opposed to the stuff that you can buy at Home Depot or Lowe's, to make it easier for us to operate and to provide those services to customers.
Great.
Because a lot of that goes back to the old days and of people getting ripped off and people drilling holes and stuff. You don't do that anymore. It's Velcro sticking on the wall.
Totally. Hey, Rob, would you mind asking your question by microphone? Maybe we could get you a mic. Great, thanks, Eric.
Rob Howley with Cox. The question I have for the panel is, we're seeing an evolution of PEG, how people watch PEG programming, and it's gone from just being on a particular channel to a lot of cities and towns taking the content that they want their citizens to see and putting it on the websites. And it seems, via YouTube or et cetera. Do you think that this is going to catch on to other states and cities and towns? Because it seems as though that is really the better use of how people really are going to be educated about the things that they are really most impactful for them, versus just kind of watching something on TV that you may or may not get a chance to do, but rather getting your PEG programming online via the internet. Just open it up.
Should catch on, I think. It's it's still interesting though why the cable industry would be responsible for funding something that can be received over the internet by cable customers and non-cable customers still sort of baffles me. But as a way of disseminating information, I think it's a good development. And I think that you'll see more and more of that. It's something that, not many of our customers watch that much. And, there's a small niche of people in towns that are interested in it, and that's fine. So I think the internet would be an appropriate place to sort of facilitate that programming. I still, though, does strike me that the cable industry is the one that's funding something that really is being made universally available, whether or not you're a cable customer.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I think Adam's hit it on the head. Is that this was an idea that was put in place 35 years ago with the '84 Cable Act, and that technology and simply the way people live has completely moved past it. I mean, how many of your teenagers go online and will, sit and watch Channel 18, I mean, my mother does, but that's a different demographic. But that's a question. I think the 621 order that the FCC just released will help bring that time of reckoning over what does this cost, who is footing the bill, and what is the value to the community. I think Cox is willing to do its fair share, but when you're sending it out to the world, including our competitors who don't contribute anything to the service, I think that's an issue.
Yeah. Okay, I think we had a question in the back too, right?
Yeah,
Yep.
I don't know if I need a mic.
There you go.
I was intrigued by your discussion on the privacy aspect of this, and what I've heard from a lot of people is, well, we had this big problem with Alexa, and that never left their minds. So the remote that you have that's wireless, is that a device that's capable of listening? I know the telephones, when I worked with the Department of State, we used to have to shut them off because they can be used as a listening device. So I've heard a lot of the older people say, well, I don't want anybody listening to me. The convenience is great, but can you explain that?
Yeah, and could we get your name and where you're from? I'm sorry, I already knew Rob, so.
Representative Callie Pitts, Portsmouth.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Representative. We got it. Thanks for being here. Going to leave it to you guys to tackle one of these. Since Comcast came up with this voice remote.
It strikes me that those are all the right questions with respect to privacy. With any technology, what do you have? What are you storing? Are you selling it? What are you doing with it? And so whether it's a voice remote today and it's another technology tomorrow, isn't the first answer is, are you willing to clearly tell me what you are gathering and what you're doing with that information, and so that I can make an informed choice? And so that, I think, is that's the essence of the solution to all of this. And I really think the folks that are working to legislate are in good spirit, trying to get largely at that. I mean, there are certainly other motives of some. If we can get to that, we solve the problem, and every month's going to have another technology, and every month then should have another set of questions, and they should have readily attainable answers. So that's what we've tried to do, is post on our website and in blogs what our policy is, and I think that's probably the answer, and I think most companies are doing the same. But the day of these 17-page nuanced privacy statements that acknowledge that you might have collected, those days are over, or they should be over.
Right.
Can I follow up?
Yeah, of course.
So are you saying to me that those devices like the remote, the voice remote, can collect data? I think that's what I just heard. So what are you collecting it, and why are you collecting it? Is that what you just said to me?
No, I was really trying to address the question of any device that, I don't know about Alexa. I don't know what that does exactly, but I do know that whoever provides that service should make that clear to those who might have it in their house, and make so that informed decision can be made about whether I want it in my house. And that is really going to continue. this is the beginning, not the end of this issue, isn't it? I think so.
Yeah.
I have Xfinity at home where I live, because I don't live in a Spectrum market, and my service is very good, by the way. I've never spoken into my remote and had an ad pop up on the internet, about whatever I spoke into the remote about. I don't know the first thing about the technology and whether or not I couldn't answer your question, quite frankly. But I know but I have spoken into an Alexa and seen an ad pop up on the internet shortly after doing that. So I can't answer it for my company. It's something we could find out. But all of our companies really support some sort of affirmative opt by the customer, whether it's opt in, opt out, et cetera. I think John's point is that customers should have the right to elect whether or not they're interested in you being able to sell, share, use that data, and that it should be clearly defined in a way that allows you to make that choice.
So and here's the difference between our companies and some of these other technology, Amazon, Alexa. When you sign up for Alexa or one of these Facebooks, you go in, there's a screen, it says, here's our privacy policy, click to agree, or you can scroll down, or you can do whatever, but you want to use it, you want to get it set up, so you click through. My company sends you a written document every year in the mail that you can read at your leisure. It explains what the privacy policies and rules are. To your point, John, that document has gotten shorter and shorter, and we've tried to make it clearer and more comprehensible so that anyone can understand it and clearly understand what you're doing. That's a difference between what cable operators, what we do, versus the Amazons or the Facebooks or any other app or website that you tend to go to. We send it to you in writing, and it's something that you can really look at.
So I know that we're not gathering data with our voice remote and selling that information and doing those ads. But if some company has that business plan, I think that the duty is for them to be transparent. You ought to know whether you want to buy into that or you don't.
Right.
And can I say, I think this goes back to my previous comment about the relationship between these companies and their customers is different than other competitors and other companies in the innovation spectrum. And they understand that if they were to violate that trust, they can go somewhere else. Because as you just heard from the previous panel, there's so much competition out there. And that's why I think it's a different makeup between our companies and their customers and others.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, because there's the scary part of those devices, and then there's this helpful part of those devices, right? People want to use them because they enable them to do things. And I know we at Cox have talked a lot about helping with an aging baby boomer population, right? Where we actually have, maybe an Alexa in the house. Or, I've seen this technology where you have a prescription little box that can be hooked to the internet, and you can know if your mother or father are taking their prescription every day. You can know when they got out of bed. And so, are we using these technologies in helpful ways as well? And we're powering it with the broadband, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's nice to be able to just, speak into your remote and say, Nationals, World Series, and have it come up.
Yeah, remember scrolling through the channel?
Yeah.
Very difficult. So Adam,
who knows what channel things are on these days?
Right. I'm sorry, Tim, did you want to say something?
I was going to say, if you were here last year, we had a panel on telemedicine, and I think that's the future. I think for all three of these companies, all ISPs, they know that the delivery of healthcare should be front of mind, and it will be front of mind from a cost containment standpoint and from an accessibility standpoint. I really believe that you're going to see these companies make a huge play in that field going forward, because as that baby boomer population grows and as they age, the opportunity there is endless.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to switch gears for a second and go to a question that's a little more personal. So Adam, why don't we start with you with, give us a political figure you admire and why.
Charlie Baker.
Tell us a little bit about that. Because he's number one on the list of the favorite governors.
No, because I know my crowd.
Ah, yes.
Well, in the world that we live in, many of us, represent the company before various different state legislatures, local governments. And it's sort of our responsibility to work with whoever is in power, and I think that's lent itself for me to be politically more of a centrist in my views. And I think Massachusetts has a long history of sort of centrist views, regardless of which side of the political aisle you're in. I happen to live in Maryland now, and Larry Hogan is another example of, I think, a great, governor who has bridged the interests of more conservative people in the rural areas of Maryland and some of the more urban population centers in places like Baltimore. And so I think that the most appropriate way, to govern is to try to find consensus. And I think Charlie Baker's a good example of that. I think Larry Hogan's a good example of that. And so, those are the kind of folk that I admire in the work that I do, people who are looking to find middle ground and, compromise on issues.
Yeah, maybe we could take your spiel up to DC and see how that works out. How about you, John?
I like that answer. I like that answer a lot. Another answer that feels personal to me is I have come to really like those that are willing to be at the tip of the spear and speak clearly to it. So Ajit Pai comes to my mind at the FCC. I mean, she's laying it out there. And some others that go maybe against the flow of who brought them, but who do it thoughtfully and have thought it through and know they're going to take some grief. So I think in terms of presidents, some of President Clinton's pro-business activities, and we can talk about the specifics one, actually cost him a little bit. He got through it just fine, but cost him a bit. I think about Richard Nixon. It wasn't easy to appoint Walter Hickel to be at the Environmental Protection Agency or to break ground with China. So some of these that go against the stream of what brought them there stick with me.
Great. How about you, Michael?
I had a chance to reflect on that this week because the governor who I grew up in Michigan, and the man who was governor while I was growing up, Bill Milliken, died this week. I think he was 90 something, and he was Republican, a decent man who worked very hard to try to bridge the conflict between Detroit and the rest of the state, and left a legacy of honorable disagreement and compromise and working things through. And his death reminded me of how far we've come from that, and how hopefully there's a path back to leaders like that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. And Tim?
So as someone who used to work for Charlie Baker, I could say that I agree with Adam that he's a unique figure in our politics today, and he has a slogan that I try to live by and try to instill in our organization. Do less of what doesn't work and do more of what does work. And I think those are brilliant words. And I think that he has been such a thoughtful voice and a stabilizing voice in Massachusetts. And I think that, I said today in the Massachusetts panel, if for those of you who weren't there, the perception of Massachusetts was a decade ago, 15 years ago, what it is today. Part of that was Deval Patrick, but a lot of it's because of Charlie Baker. And I'm really proud to live in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts because of leadership like that, and also our legislative leaders as well. But I will say, I thought about this as well. And as hokey as it sounds, FDR is probably the person that I admire the most, because there is no one who has confronted more problems in the history of the world and be able to take this country, guide it as long as he did, and to be able to bring us through what he brought us through is a remarkable statement. And I think the longer we move away from his 4 terms, the more that I think that the world will look at him as someone that, without him, who knows what the world would look like today. So.
Yeah. I'm going to answer this as a moderator. Many of the people in this room know I can't help myself but to mention James Cox. So for those of you who don't know, the founder of our company, James Cox, actually ran for president. He was a 3-term governor of Ohio. He was in Congress and then ran for president in 1920 against Warren Harding, who, we all think James Cox should have won that race. He's on the bottom of the list of favorites. But his running mate was none other than FDR. And so a lot of people don't know that fact, but the wonderful thing, I think, for us working at Cox is that commitment to service is embedded in the company by our founder. And it was one of the things that excited me about moving into this company, just that real dedication and a commitment to our customers and employees. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention him. And I know Amy Horan on our Rhode Island team is laughing at me right now.
Can I just add,
yeah.
Michael mentioned the word earlier, culture. And I think that as someone who's represented them for 3 years, and yes, I get paid by them, but I say this genuinely, the culture of these companies and the way they treat their customers is stellar, world-renowned, I think. And I think that starts with people like the founder of Cox and the Roberts family, et cetera. And I'm not saying this because they pay me, it's because I genuinely feel that way, so.
Great, great. So Adam, can you talk about a situation where a policymaker has done something really great that you've kind of, woken up in the morning and said, wow, they really got it?
Sure. Well, I always joke with my team because they'll often talk to me about a piece of legislation and cite me the number of the bill. And I'm like, we're in 41 states. It's a little bit difficult for me to remember, this particular number. Can you tell me a little more about the subject matter? But one piece of legislation from this past session stands out in particular, and I actually do remember the number because it was SB 1152, which was a piece of legislation that we worked on with Comcast in Texas. And it was before even the FCC 621 order came out, in which it, the 621 order talked about a mixed-use network, a network that provides both cable television and broadband and voice services. And there had been an effort, has been an effort underway in some jurisdictions to try to, charge right-of-way fees for access to the right-of-way for the different services, as opposed to looking at the network holistically as a single network that is utilizing the right-of-way. And even before the 621 order came out in Texas, we were able in the last legislative session to get a law passed that they had separate right-of-way fees for video service, your cable franchise, and then they had a separate fee for the provision of voice services over that same network. And we got a piece of legislation passed that basically said, whichever one you're paying more into, you should continue to pay, but you shouldn't pay both. And that was, kind of predated the 621 order, in which it was sort of affirmed that these are single networks, providing multiple services, and that it was not good for investment in innovation or for our customers to have them pay for the use of the network twice. So in Texas, we were able to get this law passed in the last session, and that was an instance in which I thought that the policymakers really got it right in recognizing that these fees are ultimately borne by our customers, and in recognizing that it was an impediment to innovation and investment.
Great. We only have a couple minutes left. John, was any example, or Mike?
I was interested in Adam's answer. What I'm struck with are so many legislators who are sort of top tier in their states that volunteer to be or seek to be the chair of the utilities committees or these sort of complex economic committees when they probably have the experience and tenure and maybe leaders enough in their caucus to chair the tax committee or the appropriations committee or the like, but there's that slice of them, and there's a dozen or two around the country that seek out these economic committees. The regulatory committees, they're sort of complex. Half the issues are just downright boring, and a few of them are really interesting. And they dig in, and they tend to have one personality type that stands out to me, and that is they like to bring differing interests together into a room at 3:15, on some Thursday afternoon without any lights there, and roll up their sleeves for 3.5 hours and try to get it done. And I really respect that.
Yeah, a lot of time, and they're not usually paid a lot of money. Okay, I think we're just at the, did you want to mention? Okay, we're just at the point of wrapping up, but I wanted to thank you all. I think that, those last comments, our legislators are so key in helping to move this industry forward, creating jobs in the community alongside of us, and investment into the communities. So we're very grateful for all of your assistance in doing that and taking the time to understand our issues. So thank you to the audience for being here, and thank you to all of you for your time.
Thank
you.